saloon. The time, in my opinion, the time has come for her to stand up and to do... Do you remember the film Love Actually, where the British Prime Minister stands up to a bullying US President? Theresa May needs a Love Actually moment. She needs to stand up and say, we are the United Kingdom, a proud, free people that have voted to take back our sovereignty, our independence, our self-determination, control over our own futures, and we will not be talked down to and bullied by unelected bureaucrats like Barnier. Now, either get real and come to the table and talk about a sensible future trade deal, or do you know what? We're off, and you don't get your 40 billion. Can you imagine what the response would be if she did that? Well, of course, in Westminster, the careerists would be appalled, and vast sections of the liberal media would barely be able to sleep at night. But I contend, out in the country, in their millions, people would be at home having their tea. They'd stand up and they'd cheer. They'd say, I don't believe it. A British Prime Minister that wants to stand up for our national interest in the face of this humiliation. And what's fascinating is it wouldn't just be Conservative or UKIP voters cheering her. Millions of Labour voters would do as well. She'd carry the country with her. She'd turn the whole Brexit debate around. Is it going to happen? I don't know. But I tell you what, it's like a big, open goal. So I wonder, does Mrs May deserve one last chance to stand up to these horrid, shocking, arrogant, elite, out-of-touch EU bullies? And I'm going to be generous, because I so often am, to the Prime Minister, and say, yes, she does deserve this one last chance. And we're going into a critical phase here, because the big European summit happens on March the 22nd, 23rd. It's not very far away. That is the moment at which the transition deal, the trade deal, will all be discussed with the other leaders. And I kind of think that if she was to stand up to these bully boys, she might just find some other prime ministers and presidents around the rest of Europe would back her position too. Because don't forget, it's not just us that's being bullied. The Poles are on the verge of having all their voting rights suspended. The Hungarians are being treated as if they're some appalling neo-fascist regime. I mean, they interfere everywhere. The only place the EU doesn't interfere is, of course, in Catalonia, where it's perfectly acceptable, according to Brussels, for the police to beat up and injure 950 people who wanted to go out and vote in a Sunday morning referendum. So this is a big bullying tendency that we're seeing right across the whole of the European Union, across the European project, and a British Prime Minister that stood up would carry the country, of that I'm certain, but I think she would also find big support coming from across the rest of Europe too. That is my view. I think I've made it fairly clearly. I don't think any of you will be in any doubt. But of course, this is LBC, the great open democratic radio station where we don't try to rewrite the rules. We say it's up to you. Come and tell me whether I'm right or whether somehow I've got this twisted and completely wrong. And you can do that, and we'll take all sides of the argument. Ring 0345 6060 973 if you think our Prime Minister deserves one last chance. If you think she's blown enough chances and fluffed it already, well, you can, of course, text to 84850. And within reason, I'll take any opinion, provided it's clean, as we're before the watershed. And you can do that by tweeting using the hashtag Farage and LBC at LBC. You can watch me on Facebook. We're here in London. Steve is on the line from Islington. Good evening, Steve.
Nigel. That was a lovely little speech you put down there, but, you know, it's all sort of jingoistic rubbish, isn't it, really? I mean, it was we that decided to leave. I'm sure they would want us to stay, but we've told them we're going to leave, and we've asked them for a transition period to help us. Okay, it helps them out as well, but generally it's to help us. And the idea of saying, if you don't let us leave on our terms, we'll leave anyway. Well, the idea was we was leaving, isn't it? So we don't really have much to bargain with.
Why, Steve? Why do we need a transition? Article 50, it took them 9 months, right, to trigger Article 50. And then Article 50 was a 2-year period. Article 50 was the transition period.
Well, the reason why we're having a transition period is to help our businesses in the transition. I mean, we do have businesses in this country that currently deal with the EU. It would be unfair just to leave them there hanging, having to work out new trade tariff deals and stuff. So that's what the transition period will deal with. So at the moment, it doesn't really affect any problems with markets outside the EU.
Yes, it does, Steve. Yes, it does, Steve, because we go on charging very high tariffs on all sorts of goods coming into our country from outside the EU, and we're prohibited, not just during Article 50, but during the transition period that follows it, from signing new trade deals.
Yeah, well, what you're stating is it will prevent us or slow us down from doing new trade deals with countries outside the EU. But at the moment, we've got businesses that aren't on the verge of collapse, that are up and running, and I think it's far better to keep them in place rather than to hope that we can get new deals off the ground on something that hasn't been agreed yet.
I'll tell you what I'll do, Steve. I will, for a moment, bury my objections to the transition period. All right? I will accept the argument you've made. I don't really agree with it, but I'll accept the argument you've made. Is it, under those circumstances, Steve, acceptable for us to sign up to arbitrary power vested in the European Commission for crimes as yet unknown, for them to be able to punish us during that period?
Well, you talk about punishing, but they're just doing a Donald Trump, and yet EU first. I mean, they're working in the interest of the EU and the remaining 27 member states. We are the ones that have decided to leave. I'll tell you what, Steve, let's just leave them. Well, if we leave, then that affects the current business that we have dealing with the EU. All we'd be doing was upsetting our businesses that are already probably successful and employ people in this country, and we'd be putting them at risk and their businesses at risk and making people unemployed. Just so that we can sort of spite the EU, and I don't think that's really fair on businesses that are up and running.
Are you prepared, Steve? Are you prepared to accept arbitrary power vested in the hands of people like Barnier and Juncker?
Well, from what I understand, we would still be operating under the current rules and regulations that exist at the moment.
Yes or no,
it's
Steve?
Unlikely. Until we actually leave, it's unlikely that any rules and regulations new brought in during that transition period will affect the transition period.
They've made it very clear, Steve, that any new laws, including new fishing quotas, for what is the piddling amount that is left of our once great fishing industry, they've made it very, very clear that during that period of time, rules will be imposed upon us over which we have no say. They could be really nasty, Steve, couldn't they?
Well, I somehow doubt it, because they will want a future trading relationship with us. But I think that when I hear people from the EU talk about this, they all seem very well-mannered and well-measured about it. It only seems to be us, the Brits.
Well, so you think it's well-mannered and well-measured for a leaked document to explain to us overnight that going through a court, going through any sort of form of due process or rule of law is too inconvenient during the transition period. Steve, I'll ask you one last time. Would it be acceptable, even if I agree with your premise on a transition deal, which I'm doing for the sake of this argument, not because I believe in it, would it be acceptable for us to sign up to arbitrary rule for a 2-year period? To become a Vichy state?
We would know what those rules were.
No, we wouldn't.
It would be unlikely that we would sign up.
I tell you what, Steve, you have greater faith in these people than I have. You're listening to the Nigel Farage Show here on LBC. It's 7:17. A leaked document shows that the European Commission want powers during this transition period to punish us without the reference to any court. Pure arbitrary powers. I believe it's time that our Prime Minister stood up and said, enough is enough. Susan says to me on Facebook, it's time for Mrs May to tell them how it is as far as the Brits are concerned. There are too many threats coming from the EU for us to toe the line. Barry says, if we allow any period of transition, they will asset strip the GB during that period. Well, Barry, if we were prepared not to be, and she did say today she'd be robust, but hey, so far we've caved into virtually everything. If we were to sign up to this, Barry, they could perhaps do us very great harm during that period. Richard on Twitter says, your speech just gave me the goosebumps. Oh, I'm sorry for upsetting you like that. Teresa has a very good point. She says, May should learn some lessons from the suffragettes and go in for a bit of disobedience. Oh, do you know what, Teresa? If she did, the country would go mad. They'd be behind her. Imagine it. A British Prime Minister standing up for our interests. Wow. Ross is on the line from Doncaster. Good evening, Ross.
Evening, Nigel. How are you?
I'm all right, but I looked at those leaked documents, Ross, and I just thought we can't go on with this.
I agree. I think, however, the main problem is that people are focusing on Theresa May too much. It's not her that's the problem. It's David Davis. He's completely incompetent, incapable of doing the job that's been assigned to him. And from what I've seen of him, he seems to be far too proud of his own abilities when he lacks the ability required to negotiate these huge changes to constitutional, economic and political situations we're in. Regarding the recent announcement from the EU, the biggest problem for me is their announcement that they can circumvent the authority of the European Court of Justice, the highest court within the European Union. If we can't go there to dispute issues between the EU and the UK, they can effectively just punish us in any way they want. But also regarding the statement that any action or initiative likely to be prejudicial, I think it is, to the bloc's interests that we can't take. That is, in my view, very, very vague, and I think it's purposefully vague so they can just say anything against the EU.
If we go along with this, we have given in to arbitrary law.
Exactly. I think Theresa May needs to tell David Davis, in my opinion, you're sacked. We need somebody much better in the position. But if she's going to keep him, she needs to tell him, go to the European Union, set out clear objectives of the United Kingdom and say, these are what we want. If we don't get them, we will walk away. Because whether or not the EU says it does or doesn't, it doesn't want us to just walk away.
No, of course it doesn't, really. It doesn't really. What it thinks, of course, is it can be so beastly to us, it'll make life on the outside look impossible, and we will all change our minds. But, Ross, David Davis, I've known David Davis a long time, and I confess I quite like the bloke, But I shared platforms with him up and down the country during the referendum campaign. I know that he is a true Brexiteer, or, as others would now label him, a hard Brexiteer. David Davis is doing the bidding of the cabinet, a very divided cabinet on this issue. Surely the point, Ross, really, is that it's not about David Davis, it's about our leader.
I think regarding the Brexit negotiations, it's in part Theresa May, but most of it for me is David Davis. He went to the EU and said that we need some form of recourse where it flows both ways for both the EU and the UK. And he's failed on that. They've completely ignored him. A negotiator needs to be able to command respect, and he's not done that.
Okay.
I think, you or Jacob may be a better choice.
No, well, I don't know about that. They won't never pick me, not in the month of Sundays. They picked Lord Adonis before me, I'd have thought. But Ross, I used the term earlier that if this happens, we will be a Vichy state, and I was being condemned by everybody. Do you think I was over the top?
I think the term Vichy state is the only problem people have. I think it's more vassal state is a better choice of words. The one Jacob Rees-Mogg used.
It's more tasteful.
I think it's just because. Yeah, it's more tasteful because people immediately think of Nazi Germany and the Vichy government, that sort of stuff, and it brings up horrible memories for the French. And how we've been treated at the moment, we're more like a vassal state at the moment than anything else.
OK, no, Ross, listen, thank you. And vassal state, Vichy, I used that word earlier. Of course, that was the accommodation that happened in 1940, where in Vichy, a government, ostensibly an independent government of France, ran the southern bit of France. But the truth is, of course, they were always underneath what the Nazis wanted them to do. I wasn't comparing the European Union to the Nazis. I think they're more like the communists in Soviet Russia myself. Sylvia, a new caller to the show, is calling from Richmond. Good evening, Sylvia.
Good evening. I'm delighted to be talking to you. I just wanted to say to you, it's time Theresa May woke up and smelt the coffee.
Right.
She should tell the French where to go. She's too slow and she's rubbish. She should not be in that job. Please let us get Jacob Rees-Mogg. I think he'd be a real gent and in the right place. She is rubbish. If Margaret Thatcher were here, the French would have been told long ago to jump.
Well, I don't think it's just the French, Sylvia. Monsieur Barnier is French, but actually he owes a higher allegiance to the European project. You know, his flag is not the French flag, his flag is the European flag. The anthem that he stands up the straightest to is, of course, the European anthem. But so you think if Mrs. Thatcher was in power, things would be a bit different, yeah?
Oh, gosh, I could see her now. I really would. And as you say, they are unelected. Why are we listening to them even?
Well, we have to listen to them, I suppose, because we're supposed to be in a negotiation, but it doesn't really have that appearance, does it? And it really looks like, you know, the domineering power and the crestfallen, you know, occasionally we sort of bleat, can we have better conditions and perhaps better food at breakfast? I mean, it really is as if somehow they think, you know, they think we're a hostage. And we're not a hostage, Sylvia.
No, not.
We're a free country. Sylvia, I thank you for your call and for your passion. Nigel, you're dead right. This will be her 9th life. And if she did have a Love Actually moment, I agree. We would be delirious. We would love it. I'd be jumping up and down for sure, says Alex in Norfolk. Alex, I really believe millions of people would. Elliot is calling. New caller of the show. He's from North Wales, from Connors Quay. Good evening, Elliot.
Good evening, Nigel.
So what should Mrs May do in the face of...
I'm a little bit worried at the moment, to be honest.
Go on.
Well, I did vote for Brexit back in 23rd of June. It seems like a lifetime ago now.
Yes, it does.
What can we actually do? Because Theresa May, she's not going to get a Brexit that we all voted for. And then in the next election, it's going to be her or Jeremy Corbyn. It's not going to be a very good choice for... You know, what can we actually do about it?
Well, the next election may be a very long time off, Elliot. Who knows what will happen between now and then? But I do understand your frustration. I do understand your frustration, and I am beginning to pick up from Brexit voters that the sheer negativity, the sheer delay that we're getting from the government, I do worry that one or two Brexit voters are beginning to wonder whether this is actually achievable. So perhaps you're in that category.
Yeah, well, as soon as Theresa May was elected, you saw David Cameron smile as he left office. I think he knew what was going to happen, and we're not going to end up with a Brexit we voted for at all. It's going to be some sort of, not even soft, I'd say, you know, squishy Brexit.
Does it, Elliot, does it change your mind that Brexit was the right thing to vote for?
I think if we end up as a soft Brexit as it's going to clear to be, I reckon it'd be better to remain in the actual EU rather than either actually remain or leave. Not this soppy, you know, place that still gets to make our rules and we don't get to make trade with other countries and become literally a vassal state. It's not on. It's not on. No,
well, Elliot, I think the way you feel. Do you know, I was at Stansted Airport earlier. I flew back in from Baden-Baden in Germany near Strasbourg today, and I, you know, when you meet people out there and they come and talk to me, you know, they're all kind of, Elliot, talking your language. We wanted Brexit, we wanted border controls, we wanted X, Y, Z, and we're not really getting it. Elliot, I can't tell you right now, you know, what your choice will be at the next general election. But, you know, British politics was said to have been turned upside down by the Brexit vote. Maybe you ain't seen nothing yet. Maybe there'll be a reconfiguration of political parties, because if Brexit's not delivered, I think there is going to be a wave of public anger, the likes of which we have not seen in modern times. You're listening to The Nigel Farage Show, exclusively on LBC. It's now 7:30. I want the Prime Minister to stand up to the EU bodies and most certainly not to allow them arbitrary powers during the transition period to punish us for crimes as yet even we don't know what they may be. Time to get tough, Theresa, but please come on and tell me that I'm wrong. A couple of other stories that caught my eye today. Donald Trump, if you remember, last year, on Bastille Day, was a guest of the French president. Yes, that's right. He's been for a state visit to France, and he's been all over the world. Not, of course, to this country. And apparently he was dazzled by the military parade that Macron put on through the streets of Paris. And, of course, he's been watching on Fox News. He's been watching Rocket Man, as he calls him, Kim Jong-un, and his big military parades and rocket firing and all the rest of it. So Trump has now asked the Pentagon to plan a grand parade of armed forces in Washington to celebrate US military strength. We don't know when he'll do it. I guess he'll do it in November for the 100th anniversary of the end of the First World War. Of course, the Americans were very heavily involved in that 1918 period. But one thing for certain, if the Donald wants a big military parade, there is going to be one. And one of the big stories around for the last couple of weeks, of course, we've had the celebration of the fact that 100 years ago, women were granted the vote, albeit women over 30 to begin with. And there's been a big row about feminism. You know, should men call themselves feminist? And I certainly don't identify with that terminology, to the horror of many in the London liberal media elite. But of course, 90% of men in the country don't identify that way either. And just to get this straight, before you all want to start throwing the radio out of the window or crash your cars or whatever it may be, I am not arguing against equality of opportunity in every way. But for those who say we're all the same, men and women are the same, we're not. We're just not the same. We're different. And in many ways, we ought, I think, to celebrate that difference. And one very interesting little piece of research here, that Bitcoin, Ethereum, Ripple and other cryptocurrency investors are 95% male. Why? Because men take bigger risks. Men tend to act often before they've even thought about what the consequences are. Women are much more considered when it comes to money and, in many ways, other risks in life. I guess that's why there are more male billionaires, and I guess that's why there are many more male bankrupts. Men take bigger risks. Men do incredibly stupid things that sometimes pay off. Men and women are different. And if anyone wants to text or tweet me and tell me I'm wrong about that, I'll be all ears. But 95% of those that have bought cryptocurrencies, some have made a fortune, some have lost. My experience of all these speculative bubbles is at the end of the day, there are many more losers than there are winners, but some of the winners are really big ones. Andy from Cardiff is on the line. Andy, they want the ability, arbitrarily, to punish us. Is that acceptable?
Well, Mr. F, good evening.
Good evening.
But before I make my point on that, could I ask you very politely to correct your language, young man?
Oh, gosh.
When you say punishment, the same as in the document, punishment, the actual meaning of the word sanction is a threatened penalty for disobeying a law or a rule, which makes it a sanction. So they are proposing to sanction the UK.
Well, Andy, if it was the breach of a law or a rule, that is something that a court would interpret. But they are suggesting in this case, Andy, that the courts are bypassed because it all takes too long, and that they, the unelected commission, should be able to decide. So, hey, I tell you what, whether it's a punishment or a sanction is perhaps a moot point. But surely we can't sign up to this principle, can we?
No, we shouldn't. I think that the next meeting through the doors of number 10 should be the head of the WTO. And I think it should be a private meeting between the Prime Minister, members of her cabinet, and the Brexit crew, between them and the head of the WTO, and to keep it private and to not leak what goes on behind those closed doors. Then watch the EU come back with their rules. Because once we look serious about going to WTO, they'll either change their minds and give us a decent deal, or they will allow us to continue down that track if they're arrogant enough to let us do so. And I think we should.
Well, certainly.
Going to be by June, we will be on WTO rules.
Well, certainly, Liam Fox's department have spent plenty of time in Switzerland meeting with the WTO. We don't know the contents of those conversations, but it's difficult to imagine, is it not, that those conversations at some point, unless the civil servants stopped it from happening, but it's difficult to imagine that hasn't been discussed. And Andy, of course, the World Trade Organization, their brief, their reason for being is to facilitate easier trade between countries. So you think, Andy, why do you think that we'll be on WTO rules by the summer?
I think that because I don't think the EU are going to budge. I think that they regret the Brexit decision, which is quite plain to see if you look at the EU Parliament of late. And I also believe that the only way that they can go forward is to keep control. Doesn't matter which way they paint it or which way they gloss it. Everything they are doing is about keeping control of what the UK does. They are terrified that the UK will be successful.
Yes.
And they will start to sink.
Yes, I agree with that. But do you think, Andy, that Theresa May will summon up the courage to make the big speech that's needed?
Oh, absolutely. I think it's not a case of whether she will summon up the courage. She needs to. And it's a necessity now.
Yes.
Now that the EU have published that document, whether it was published on purpose or by accident, it means nothing.
Yep. No.
I think it's time for Theresa May to say, OK, here's my response.
Yep. Andy, I'm absolutely with you. And if she did it, she'd carry the country. I thank you. I'm going to go to Phil in Cobham next. Phil, good evening.
Good evening, Nigel. Nigel, one simple question. An alien supranational body might have any advantage whatsoever?
Not if, I mean, generally no, but specifically no, if the leaked document itself outlines the desire or the potential need to punish us without any due process and on the basis of the use of arbitrary law. No, Phil.
Well, except, Nigel, you very often you say you're one of the few politicians who's been in business, knows what business is all about. I mean, I'm a small businessman, and I know that if I do trade with any other bigger business than I am, the trade is always conducted on their terms, not on my terms. I have to wait 90 days for payment, whatever, and I don't get a shout. They're not interested. And I think this is all you Brexiteers are missing the obvious elephant in the room here, and that is that we're going to pull away. We are a powerful trading nation in our own right. I will not dispute that, and we've always been good. But we are slipping down the league all the time, and it's just going to accelerate for the next 50 years.
How are we slipping down the league tables?
Nigel, just look then study economic forums and see that by 2050 we're going to be probably 9th or 10th in the league of GDP in the world, and we will go down because our population, Nigel. That's what it boils down to. All countries are becoming more industrialised, more modern, and the moment they move to that, you move into another plane. You're not dealing with an agrarian.
Oh, I get it.
Agrarian culture, I should say.
Agrarian.
And ultimately, as I said, this is the future of the world, and there's nothing we can do. One of the reasons why America, you go on about Trump. Yes, he wants now. The only thing America will have over, for example, China and maybe India over the next 50 years is maybe military might. That's all they'll have because by purchasing power parity, they're already down on China.
Phil, I accept completely. There is a massive transference of power from west to east going on in the world. Of course, I accept that. I know that. I can see it. However, Brexit is about, where are we best placed to deal with all of those challenges? Now, I take the view that not only on sovereignty, but if it's on economics, I take the view that actually the ability to become competitive, the ability to strike global deals puts us in a better place. But you and I could agree to disagree on that. But what I'm asking you, as somebody who comes at this from a different side of the argument, is would it be acceptable, even if they're the big guys and we're relatively small, would it be acceptable to sign up to give them arbitrary power during that 2-year transition period?
Well, from my point of view, I believe that our future, and in many respects the future of Western democracy in toto, relies in Europe staying together. I passionately believe that. And I, on this issue, I will be fighting you until the 19th of May and beyond next year, or whatever. Well, the 30th of March, I can't remember when it was.
Well, in theory, 29th of March, Phil. But we'll see.
March,
but right. But we'll see. All right. So you think Brexit's a mistake and it should be reversed? Yeah.
I think it's a terrible mistake, and I want to say, Nigel, I've lived and worked in 4 European countries. I'm in the yachting industry, and I see I've got to be. There are problems. There are systemic problems with the European Union for sure. But look what actually it has done, and we really ought to understand the system before we really. And it would help if you're someone like yourself does actually explain how the system works, because most Brexiteers I speak to don't know it.
Phil, I've been there 20 years and I've done my best on LBC to explain it objectively, whether people like it or not. I thank you for your passion and for your call. You're listening to The Nigel Farage Show here on LBC. It's 7:45. Does Mrs May deserve one last chance to stand up to the EU bullies who, according to a leaked report, want to have arbitrary powers during the transition period where they can, stop our imports of goods, they can stop us flying to Europe and do all sorts of terrible things? Should they have the power to do that? Is it? Of course they shouldn't. Nobody would agree to that, surely, to goodness. Is it time the Prime Minister stood up and said something? Do you think she's got it within her to do it? Ashley on Facebook says, I don't want her or Davis or Hammond. Well, Ashley sounds like he's given up on everybody completely. John says, get her out and Moggy in. There's quite a lot of Rees-Mogg supporters who seem to listen to this show. Eddie says, she deserves one last chance to resign. That's not desperately positive, is it? Nigel, the fact that Theresa May is having to reassure people that she's going to be robust can only mean utter failure. Do you know, I thought the very fact she was reiterating on Monday that we will be leaving the single market and the customs union. Hey, she said it a year ago in my Lancaster House speech. It was in the manifesto. And the fact she's repeating this stuff just shows you the complete confusion. And is it surprising we're confused? We've got, the Chancellor standing up at Davos effectively saying there won't be any changes. We may not call it the single market, but really it will be. And on the other end, we've got Boris saying, we've got to break free and do our own thing. So there are some really big, confusing messages out there. Helen is not very sympathetic on Twitter. She says Mrs May doesn't deserve any more chances on Brexit. How many chances has she been given already to show strength and determination? Helen, I do understand that, and I thought, frankly, the capitulation that we saw in December was awful. But you know what? Everyone deserves one last chance. Chris says, normally I would say, no, she doesn't deserve a last chance, but she forced the EU to concede on the Northern Ireland border, and as a person who lives there, that was a shot in the arm, a redeeming factor for me. I'm not quite convinced about that, Chris. They're coming back on that issue over the last 24 hours as well. Can't understand why Theresa May doesn't start making some announcements of her own that would drive a wedge between the other 27 members of the EU, like, for example, declaring that if flights between the UK and the EU are under threat post-Brexit, she will slash the tax on flights to Florida to encourage Brits to take their summer breaks there. The Spanish and Portuguese governments would go into meltdown, says Gary in Muswell Hill, but he's right, and there's loads of stuff we could do. I mentioned this a couple of days ago. We should be lobbying the French wine producers, the French farmers, and making them realise that Barnier, through his intransigence, Juncker, their own president, Macron, are leading us to a situation where they're going to find it much harder to sell their wine and cheese into this country. And when French farmers get upset, you know what they do? They protest in Paris, they riot, they generally get their own way. I'm tempted to say we should do the same with the German car workers, but they're far less likely to riot. We've got to go round the back of these horrible Brussels bullies, and I've argued that now for 18 months, and I don't see, hope I'm wrong, hope the government is doing this, I just don't see any evidence of it. Ben is a new caller from Lewisham. Good evening, Ben.
Evening, Nigel. Good to speak to you. I set my stall early. I'm a fervent Remainer.
Yep.
But I'm just very keen to hear your thoughts about the past 12, 18 months and the time that the government has spent working out Brexit. We don't seem to be any closer to getting a deal.
No.
We should be running the country rather than...
Well, Ben, obviously running the country is terribly important, and Brexit is, the biggest constitutional change that we'll see in our lifetimes. But I get the feeling, Ben, and maybe you and I can agree on this, and you're a fervent Remainer and I'm a fervent Leaver, I generally get the feeling that since the 23rd of June 2016, frankly, not very much has happened.
No, definitely. Well, apart from a lot of divisive chat within the Conservative Party, and a lot of time spent doing absolutely nothing, which could be spent looking after our country better. And
but Brexit, Ben. But Ben, do you believe that as a result of the referendum, Brexit should be delivered?
I don't agree with the results.
No.
But yes, it's a referendum, so yeah.
Yeah.
We live in a democracy, so yes.
Yeah, no,
it should be delivered.
And actually, Ben, there are lots of people out there like you, lots and lots of people who voted Remain, who say, look, hey, we did it, let's get on with it. And I think, frankly, Ben, where we're headed under this current route is the worst of all worlds. You'll be unhappy with the result, I'll be unhappy with the result, and we will finish up, wrapped up in a whole series of arrangements that effectively mean a worse form of EU membership.
So what would be your ideal? Aside from just Brexit, just separating...
Well, the ideal, Ben, the primary point of Brexit wasn't economic. Because nobody can predict in the future what will or won't happen. I mean, that's it's like calling a stock market. It's impossible. But the primary purpose was to become a self-governing independent nation. Now, on trade, the ideal is a sensible grown-up trade deal between us. But you know what? If we don't have that, don't spend years trying to get something that is unachievable. Go for a different solution. Go for a global solution. I'm not in the least bit fearful, about not being part of, their free trade zone. And by the way, free trades cost us $10 billion a year. So I just think, Ben, we've got to stop wasting time, be decisive, get on with it. But I do think, and I wonder whether you agree with me, it would be unacceptable to sign up to a transition period where the European Commission had arbitrary powers over this country.
I just don't see there's any pros, to be honest. I think from my generation, which is speaking from someone in the 30s, the baby boomers have kind of taken over and they'll be fine. But we've lost a lot, and we're not going to gain much.
Well, maybe, Ben, with the right leadership, we could.
What do you think we're going to gain from Brexit?
We will be able to be not just a democratic country, which we've, I'm afraid, failed to be properly as part of the European Union. Well, not really, when you've got foreign courts can overrule you and most of your laws are made somewhere else. Ben, I believe, economically, there's a great big world out there that we can embrace. But you know what? I may be right, I may be wrong. Ultimately, Brexit's not about economics. Ultimately, it's about us governing our own country, and that's what really matters. Ben, I thank you. Loads of messages. Brian from Pinner says, hi, Nigel, Mrs May is a manager. We need a leader. Mr Farage, the EU have proven what a thoroughly unpleasant, unreasonable bunch of people they are. Mrs May must seize the opportunity to take a stance against the EU bureaucrats, says Stephen. You know what? They are bad people. They are fanatical EU nationalists. They will stop at nothing. They never, ever take no for an answer. My last caller. Time is short, but Darryl from Uxbridge, please make your point.
Hello, Nigel, again. I'm speaking of feathers whenever I see anybody who's demeaning this country and selling it down the river like Ken Clarke, Anna Soubry and the rest, and not backing the Prime Minister and backing the people who voted for Brexit.
Well, Darryl, I understand that. But all right, Mrs May gives good speeches, Darryl. She says she'll do X, Y and Z. Then she concedes. And I'm arguing tonight, Darryl, that if she allows us to be under arbitrary law, like a Vichy state, for the 2 years of the transition period, that is just a step too far.
I totally agree with you. And whenever I'm watching Question Time, and they're all going on about Brexit and all the rest of it, my wife had to take me anything hard away from me because I might be throwing it at the cellar.
Well, Darryl, I thank you, and I'm sure there are people listening to this show that hate what I have to say and feel that they need to be perhaps restrained in some way because they're so angry about it. But that's what democratic debate does. But it would be undemocratic for us to be under arbitrary power during the transition period. I feel very strongly about it. You've been listening to the Nigel Farage Show here on LBC. I'm back tomorrow night at 7. Tonight at 10 it's Ian Collins, but up next it's Clive Bull.
Nigel, thank you.